It's good to have you back. This will be our third and final lecture on Aristotle's conception of the good life in the Nicomachean Ethics. In our last two lectures, we've been really laying the foundation for the detailed discussion of the good life. We've talked about the components of happiness in Aristotle's view. We began with the very famous function argument that started with the hierarchy argument, in which Aristotle argued that there's got to be a hierarchy of ends, there has to be a highest good. We argued that politics was the domain, dismissed a number of alternative views, and launched into the function argument proper. At the end of our last lecture, we concluded that happiness is indeed the highest good as a conclusion of the function argument that arrived at this conclusion by this careful argument that human beings indeed have a function, and that the good life is the life lived in accordance with the excellences appropriate to human beings. Hence the account of eudaimonia, of flourishing as activity in accordance with virtue. The important thing to remember at the end of our last lecture, we saw that virtue is insufficient for a good life. Activity in accordance with virtue is necessary, and that virtuous activity, Aristotle argues, is actually a pleasant thing for virtuous people. But if happiness is activity in accordance with virtue, we have two big questions to ask. We need to know A, what virtue is, and B, how you act in accordance with it. So in the present lecture, we're going to begin with a discussion of the nature of virtue. We are then going to talk about the dimensions of activity, beginning with practical wisdom or phronesis, moral strength or krate, and then the social context in which action is possible. For Aristotle, all of these are dimensions of happiness. We need to have virtue, practical wisdom, moral strength, and a social context. None of them is sufficient to be happy, but when we have all of them, we have this final self-sufficient state of happiness or eudaimonia. Moreover, each one of these is understood in a very special Aristotelian sense. Just as the word happiness means something very specific in this context, means eudaimonia, virtue is going to mean something very specific. Practical wisdom will mean something very specific. Moral strength will mean something very specific, as will friendship. So let's begin by talking about virtue itself. Aristotle begins by arguing that virtue is something that we acquire by habit. There's a nice lexical point here. The word habit in Greek is actually ethike, the word that we get ethics from. And so when Aristotle's connecting says virtue and habit, he's pointing out that virtue or goodness, ethics, is acquired by habituation. And he offers several main arguments for it. The first is what we'll call the change argument. The second is the acquisition argument. And the third is the same causes argument. The change argument goes roughly like this. If a thing has a capacity by nature, you can't change that capacity by practice. The example that Aristotle gives is the capacity of a stone to fall to the earth. No matter how many times you throw a stone up in the air, you can't habituate it to rising, because falling to the earth is part of its nature, Aristotle points out. You can't possibly habituate it. But virtues can be acquired. You can start out with a little kid who doesn't have an excellence, and by training and good upbringing, make that child virtuous. So virtues aren't natural, but they're acquired by habituation, this notion of ethikos. The second argument is the acquisition argument. For natural qualities, Aristotle points out, we first have the capacity, and then we have the activity that corresponds with the capacity. The example that Aristotle gives is perception. We first have the capacity to see by having functioning eyes, and then we see. We first have the capacity to hear, and then we hear. We could also use the example of our heartbeat. We first have a functioning heart, and then it's able to beat at appropriate rates. It's not that our heart learns to function by beating first. But for things that are acquired, Aristotle argues, we practice first and then develop the capacity. For instance, he points out, it's by practicing building houses that we become good builders. It's by practicing playing music that we become musicians. It's by practice riding horses that we become good equestrians. And Aristotle points out, virtue is like the latter, not like the former. We practice virtuous actions in order to become virtuous. So for all of these reasons, we have the conclusion that virtue is acquired by habituation, not by nature. Finally, we have this kind of same causes argument. This is a kind of fun argument. Aristotle points out that it's a characteristic of things like arts and athletic performance, that the same kind of thing that produces excellence in the domain can also destroy it. If you practice building really sloppy, shoddy houses, you're going to become a really bad carpenter. And if you practice building houses carefully and well, you'll become a good carpenter. If you practice music badly, if you miss your steps on your scales, or if you use bad technique, you'll become a bad musician out of practice. But if you practice music well, paying attention to technique, paying attention to your scales, you'll become a good musician. And these require instruction. It's the same with moral virtue. We acquire it by careful training, and if we behave well, we become good people. If we get habituated to behaving badly, we become bad people, and it can be ruined by bad training. So for all of these reasons, Aristotle argues, virtue is a matter of habit and habituation, not a matter of our natures. I want to read Aristotle's point on this. In one word, states of character arise out of like activities. This is why the activities we exhibit must be of a certain kind. It's because the states of character correspond to the differences between these. Then he emphasizes, it makes no small difference then, whether we form habits of one kind or of another from our very youth. It makes a very great difference, or rather, all the difference. For Aristotle, therefore, child-rearing is of the absolute essence in bringing up people who are going to be virtuous, who are going to be happy, who are going to be good citizens. The next question, now that we know that virtue is something that's acquired by habituation, is what's the relationship between, how do we tell that somebody's virtuous? That is, what's the relationship between virtue, pleasure, and pain? What's the difference between merely acting virtuously and being virtuous? This is the solution to a kind of chicken and egg problem that arose from the point about acquisition a moment ago. If we become virtuous by performing virtuous actions, how do we perform the virtuous actions? Well, aren't we already virtuous in that case? Aristotle argues that pleasure and pain is the real test here. You can tell that somebody has a virtue because they take pleasure in acting virtuously. Somebody who doesn't finds the virtuous actions that they end up performing painful. And so Aristotle puts the point this way: we must take as a sign of states of character the pleasure or pain that supervenes upon acts. For the man who abstains from bodily pleasures and delights in this very fact is temperate, that is self-controlled. He who stands his ground against things that are terrible and delights in this, or at least is not pained, is brave, while the man who is pained is a coward. For moral excellence is concerned with pleasures and pains. It is on account of the pleasure that we do bad things, and on account of the pain that we abstain from noble ones. Hence we ought to have been brought up in a particular way from our very youth, as Plato says, so as both to delight in and to be pained by the things that we ought, for this is the right education. So the point is this: even though people may be performing virtuous actions before they fully acquire virtues, say as apprentice adults, it's not always fun to do so, and they might chafe. But you can tell that somebody's virtuous when they perform the action and take pleasure in doing so. And so now more on the chicken and egg problem. Aristotle raises it explicitly. The question might be asked what we mean by saying that we must become just by doing just acts, and temperate by doing temperate acts. If men do just and temperate acts, they are already just and temperate, exactly as, if they do what is in accordance with the laws of grammar and of music, they are grammarians and musicians. So Aristotle here is emphasizing this chicken and egg problem. If we become just by performing just acts, become temperate by performing temperate acts, how do we perform these acts in the first place? Well, here's what he says. He asks the question,